say. Next we have the great story of the 5,000. This is the only miracle that all four Gospels tell. And we talk about it as being the miracle of the 5,000, but there was probably about 20,000 who were fed, because there were 5,000 men. There were probably as many women, and there would have been lots of kids. So here is a miracle told 4 times over. Matthew tells it, Mark tells it, Luke tells it, John tells it. But this is the only miracle that's told by all 4. Look at the story. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, to where there was a desolate region. Great crowd of people followed him. They ran around the side of the lake. You know, curiosity and the love of excitement will draw a crowd anywhere. We're very curious people. That's why we like gossip. Though most gossip is sinful. But curiosity and a love of excitement creates a crowd. So a crowd goes around the lake to get where he's gone by boat. But he'd gone over there to get a bit of peace and quiet. Even the Son of God needed a break. The Sabbath is a principle of life. It's not just one day a week experience. You should have a Sabbath every day. We need breaks recurringly. Need rest. And he'd gone to have a rest and spent some time with his family of disciples. But from the mountainside he looks down, he sees all the crowd gathering, milling, enlarging. And here's another place where Jesus is so different to me and you. He loved the crowds. He loved the crowds. He had compassion on them, it says. Very few of us are ever tempted to love a crowd. We might be curious about the crowd, but we don't usually love a crowd, but he did. So he gives up his thoughts of rest and he comes out to meet them. When he looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where we buy bread that these people will eat?" Actually, he spent all day teaching before he crossed the lake, and even teaching on this side. And he's tired, people are tired, and they're hungry. So he asked Philip, "Where will we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him. You know, in the Gospels, Christ asked over 100 questions. He never ever did supernaturally what could be done naturally. Here's one of the questions. But he asked this to test him. Philip said, 8 months' wages wouldn't do. Another of his disciples, Andrew, spoke up. "There's a boy here with 5 bread rolls and 2 sardines. How far will they go among so many?" This is a picture of the wilderness of this world with billions of people who are spiritually starving. And we're the disciples. And we're like Philip, we say, "Oh, how on earth can we help all those people?" Or we're like Andrew, where we got a printing press and we've got a bit of tithe money, but what's that among so many? One man looks at the problem, the other man looks at the resources, but the little boy looked at Jesus. He was only a little boy. The Greek word means a lad, a tiny boy. And he's got his lunch with him, 5 bread rolls and 2 sardines. That's still a small lunch for a healthy boy. But he looks at Jesus, puts it in Christ's hands. Christ says, "Make the people sit down." Mark tells us a lot of green grass in the place. God had provided cushions for this feast. And now the people are going to be organised a bit, otherwise there'd be a lot of chaos. And he wanted the people to see what was happening. So the thousands, probably 20,000, sit down all around him. He's in the centre. The 12 are gathered around him. There are the 5 bread rolls. There are the 2 sardines. And as he hakes them in his hand and begins to give to the disciples, keeps on going. Keeps on going. Remember the story about the woman in the Old Testament story, and I think it's 2 Kings, maybe chapter 3 or 4, where she says, "A creditor's coming to take my house." and I've got no money. And the prophet says, well, what have you got in the house? She says, I've only got a little pot of oil. He says, go and gather all the empty bottles you can get. Go and get all the empty bottles from your neighbours, as many as you can. And when they gather them all, the prophet said to her, now you pour out your little bit of oil. And it never stopped pouring. He said, sell it and pay your debt. You know, there's an old mythical story about how the sea became salty. An inventor invented a machine that could make salt. And salt in ancient times was worth a lot of money. It was the seasoning for food. But this machine is being transferred from one place to another. And it accidentally got started on board ship. And a storm came up. And the ship went down, the machine kept going. That's how the sea became salty. That's a very familiar myth. But here's the reality. The little in the hands of Jesus become great. You know, there's another story where he fed a smaller group and he had more to start with and he had less left over. Now please note, the less he has to start with and the more he's got to care for, we'd expect he'd have the less left over, but it's the opposite. The less he has to start with, the more he has to care for, the more left over, 12 baskets full. When he feeds a smaller group, and he's got more to start with, he's got less left over, which arouses the question, how many could he have fed if he'd only started with a crumb? You know, Philip said, how could we fill these people up? Andrew says, this is so little. What have we got? Fancy talking about impossibilities when Jesus was there. But you and I are the same. I'm the same. I confront a problem and say, oh, I don't see how even God could solve this. But of course he can. Of course he can. So we can be like Philip, look at the problem. We can be like Andrew, look at the human resources. Or we can be like the little boy and look to Jesus. Take your pick. Only one of them works. Only one of them works. The whole Christian era is summarised in this chapter. This single chapter, John 6, gives us 2,000 years of church history in one chapter. How come? Well, when you read on, it says the people say, hey, this is the general we want to fight the Romans. He can provide the food for the armies and he can heal the wounded. This is the guy we've got to have to head up the Jewish soldiers. Then we'll throw those wretches out, see? So they want to take Jesus, make him a king. But Jesus doesn't intend to be made a king. The disciples are very happy with the idea because they'd all be major dominos and secretaries of state and financiers and so on and so on. So the disciples are very happy with the idea of the crowd. So Jesus uses a sternness. He's never full manifest, and he says, get in the boat. And reluctantly, his disciples get in the boat and leave without Jesus. And Jesus sends the crowd away. He said, I'm not going to be your king. And he goes up to a mountain. And from the mountain, he's watching the little boat. When the disciples get in the boat, they're very disturbed. Hearts are upset. Why doesn't he accept their willingness to make him a king? It would simplify everything. And all this hard trekking we're doing, it'd all be over. We'd all sit on thrones. Why doesn't he accept it? So they're very upset. So God did what he often does. It doesn't pay to get upset, because if you do, you'll get something worth being upset about. Please understand me. It's the same for all of us. There's no difference. Our hearts are all the same. It does not pay to get upset. He'll give us something to be upset about. So the storm clouds gather. This lake is 14 miles long, 9 miles broad, but it's 600 feet below sea level. And it's prone to frequent storms. And so while they're groaning and belly aching and complaining and doubting Jesus, the clouds gather. You know, big troubles are like cannibals. They eat up all the little ones. That's worth remembering. All big troubles are like cannibals. They eat up all the little ones. The other day, Jill and I were racing to go to a place, and I'd failed to bring the address with me because I knew Jill had somewhat of the idea, and we didn't find it. And I was champing at the bit. But the thing that made me feel a bit better was, well, Jill's a good driver, we haven't had an accident, we've still got all our limbs and a brain, and they will get there late. I'll still give the talk, it'll be okay. So if you think of what could have been, because the big troubles are cannibals, they eat up all the little ones. But it doesn't pay to mess about the little ones, because if you do, they'll grow and grow and grow. So when it's the fourth watch of the night and they've been rowing for 7 or 8 hours, I have a rowing machine at home, and if I do 15 minutes, I feel very, very elevated, very, very proud about Desmond Ford. 15 minutes, they're rowing for 8 hours in a storm. Billows threatening to come down and drown them. Sky is black, they can't see the shore, and Jesus is not with them. How could it be worse than that? And then they see a light and they think it's a ghost. And they're scared that an evil spirit is coming. That's going to make everything worse now. The demons are coming. But as the light gets nearer, they hear a familiar voice. It is I. Don't be afraid. It's Jesus. Peter says, it's really him. And he calls out, if it's you, bid me come. Jesus says, come. So Peter gets out of this rolling boat, and as long as he keeps his eye on Jesus, he's walking on the water. But then a billow comes between him and Christ, and he loses sight of Christ, and he follows the billows one after another, and he begins to sink. Calls out, Jesus puts out his hand. Wherefore didst thou doubt? They get into the boat, the storm stops, and immediately they're at the shore. What a story. How often I'm like Peter. I don't look at Jesus, I look at the storm, which is foolish, childish, very unchristian, and very typical of believers. When Peter took his eyes off Christ and looked at the storm, he began to sink. And if you and I look at the problems, the troubles, and everybody's got them, we kid ourselves. We see some people, we think, boy, they must have a great life. They haven't got any problems. Listen, those people have never been born yet. Everybody has problems. Everybody. So here's a great story for us. It is so practical. Let's take a break.